Welcome to the Great Books Mini Lectures here at Johnson County. This will be our first one of the year. We'll have 5 more this year, and we hope you do attend. My name is Michael Carragher. I'm an assistant professor of English here at the college, and along with Maureen Fitzpatrick, we are organizing the series yet again. We hope you join us on the first Wednesdays of the month here at the CoLab at noon. Next month, October, we'll have Professor David Davis talking about Dracula. So please come back. To begin, Jay Antle is Professor of History and the Executive Director of the JCCC Center for Sustainability. Jay has taught for several colleges, and he has been connected with Johnson County since 1997. I believe he joined full-time faculty in 2000. His work with the sustainability program took shape officially about a decade ago. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from Angelo State University, a Master's in Western History from Arizona State University, and a doctorate in American Environmental History from the University of Kansas. With all those degrees, you can kind of see the range of his interests. They include climate, weather, ecology, environment, and issues wrapped up in conservation and sustainability. Jay has written and presented on those topics and notions of the West, the wilderness, buffalo, cattle, ranching, and rangelands. And aside from his duties here at the college, Jay is an avid hiker and storm chaser. For our presentation today, Professor Antle has chosen J.R.R. Tolkien's 1954 work, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. We asked him particularly why he chose that novel and why that particular novel in the collection. And he said, quote, "It played an important role in my intellectual development as a historian and has served as a steady guide for me as I've moved into the world of environmental work." I suspect we'll hear a little bit about that history and the connection to his work today. At the end of his remarks, we'll always, as always, we have time for questions, so as those arise, please keep them near and dear to you so we can offer them. Friends, Jay Antle.
All right. Thanks, folks, for coming out, particularly on a day where there's a big scholarship luncheon going on at the same time, where lots of folks, I think, are currently, and this is going to be apparently an issue we'll deal with the entire day. Okay. All right, so this is a historian's journey through Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and given that the Lord of the Rings is a massive set, I'm not going to be able to talk about everything you all want to hear about, but certainly hope we should have time for questions. So this will be sort of a select set of things that I find fascinating and have always found fascinating with the Lord of the Rings, although one of the things I'll talk about is what I find interesting in the Lord of the Rings has changed over time. And so I go back to it, and every time I read it, there's something else that speaks to me, or some part of it speaks to me more than it did when I first read it back in junior high. All right, so first of all, junior high context. So Lord of the Rings comes to me about the same time as all of this stuff, right? So comic books, Daredevil, X-Men. I sort of graduated listening to big band music to Black Sabbath, Blue Oyster Cult, Rush, all of that stuff. So it's also collectively could fit into the story of the making of a junior high geek, and it all certainly fits together. Although I will say that I can't remember exactly the chronology by which of these things happened first. They all more or less happened simultaneously. And this is also the same time period I got involved in Dungeons and Dragons, and those of you who might remember this period of the 80s, this is when Dungeons and Dragons was, of course, considered to be part of the Satanic Menace, which was going to destroy the moral fiber of America. And here are a couple examples of one such anti-Dungeons and Dragons comic where someone who was playing D&D immediately then became part of Witch's Coven and began sacrificing people, and the world goes to hell in a handbasket. I don't remember any of the things ever happening in any of the D&D games that I played. But anyway, this is all part of that same kind of world. Although for me, so I was beginning to read science fiction and fantasy in sort of bulk. Way too many mediocre Piers Anthony books, Dragon Riders of Pern. But then along comes this new devilry, the actual Lord of the Rings themselves. And these are the Ballentine paperback editions that I actually bought with the illustrations by Professor Tolkien himself on the covers. And what I can't remember exactly is exactly what year I got Fellowship of the Ring, or even how I got Fellowship of the Ring. There's a slim chance it might have been through a Scholastic Book Fair or something like that. I mean, that's possible. But what I remember about reading Fellowship of the Ring was this landscape, not the way Tolkien paints it, but the way the Shire resonated in my head. There was something about that landscape in the very vivid way that Tolkien was able to describe that landscape to me in that first book that stuck with me. And that was the thing perhaps that I remember the most about that. So if we're talking about Lord of the Rings and what I remember the most about it and how it's changed over time and affected me differently, the first thing I remember were these very vivid landscape descriptions, which for some reason, perhaps, I spent my summers with my grandparents on their farm. Perhaps it was that kind of a landscape that hit me. But those landscape descriptions, I will never forget. And then, after I devoured Lord of the Rings, all of it, I discovered at the back of Return of the King, there were all these extra pages of stuff. All these chronologies and all these years and all these stories that seemed to go on and go back in time, and these languages, and there just seemed to be more and more stuff to spend endless amounts of time looking at and trying to figure out. And then I discovered there were more books for me to buy, right? The Complete Guide to Middle-earth and the Atlas of Middle-earth, which convinced me perhaps that I could somehow do my science fair project on the geology of Middle-earth. And my science instructor said, no, not so much. And so unfortunately, the only thing I really remember about that science fair was the horrible bus trip to the science fair where one kid would not stop playing Jay Giles' band Freeze Frame. It was over and over and over again, and it was painful. And if you don't know, can we turn that off, the sleep function, please? And so if you don't know what that song is, it's a great song until you hear it 300 times in 2 days. So there's all this stuff, and when I look back on it now and I understand what was happening, was the historian in me beginning to wake up. Because there was so much depth here. And as many critics and I mean critics in the literary criticism kind of sense, have talked about with Tolkien, what makes Tolkien so unique is that he creates a secondary world with such depth and such texture. And when you remove a layer, you find something else. And there is depth and there is history which feels old and feels authentic. And so to me, as someone who would later become a historian, there was clearly something already in me that resonated with this amount of depth, this amount of material. Thank you. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about Tolkien himself. And I will say that this talk has given me a chance to actually do a little research into Tolkien, the author, his background, and how those influences in his life made their way into The Lord of the Rings, which is something I kind of casually knew about, but really hadn't done much research on. So Tolkien's born in 1892 in South Africa, and death, which plays a major role in The Lord of the Rings, death was unfortunately something he was very familiar with from a very early age. His mother brings him and his brother back to England, and while they are visiting England, his father in South Africa dies. And then in fairly short order, while Tolkien is still a relatively young man, his mother dies. And so that leaves he and his brother to be raised by a Catholic priest who more or less looks after them for at least the rest of their young lives until Tolkien becomes 18, where there's a really complicated story about how he met his wife, which if you want to hear that story, we can go through that a little bit later on. But that was an interesting interlude with the father intervening in that process and delaying the relationship for a number of years. But Tolkien, during his youth, grew up west of what is now Birmingham in England, in what was then still a relatively rural part of England. And so for him, bogs and forests and creeks were just part of the world he knew. And that familiarity with that kind of a nature, not an entirely wild nature, but nature in which people were on the periphery, plays its way very much into The Lord of the Rings. Okay, so I mentioned his rural upbringing, and he also really enjoyed what he would call the genre of fairy stories. And in particular, the one that he refers to a lot is the Red Fairy book edited by Andrew Lang. And so a lot of the caricatures of characters and types of characters that find their way in The Lord of the Rings, you can find, if you look for them, some predecessors in these kinds of fairy stories. And these kinds of exotic tales, these kind of heroic tales, combined with what seems to have been from a very early age a love of language and languages and words, began to create this kind of interesting creative brew in Tolkien's head that eventually led him, when he goes on through a whole series of complicated events, to ultimately end up going to school and ultimately all the way to Oxford to pursue his degree. He eventually begins to study what becomes known as philology, which is sort of an archaic discipline today, which was the study of the evolution of languages and the ties of those languages to the cultures from which they came. And so Tolkien loves words. He loves languages, and he loves the stories that are written in those languages, particularly old Anglo-Saxon, Germanic languages. He studies Finnish as he grows older. And so all of these languages and playing with words are essential to understanding where Tolkien's ideas come from and why The Lord of the Rings has the kind of depth that I responded to when I first encountered it. As he was growing up, he had a number of friends who were of similar minds about the importance of English literary traditions. And the letters between this initial group would be very important to Tolkien, particularly during those very rough years of World War I, which we'll get to in a moment. Again, he goes to Oxford, both as a student, and actually he finishes his degree at Oxford as World War I breaks out. And there was a program that he was able to enroll in England that allowed him to complete his degree while he was training to be an officer. And he becomes an officer in what we would call the signaling corps, because of his love of language. And I'll get to his World War experience in a moment. He becomes a professor of Anglo-Saxon, ultimately at Oxford, after he spends some time at Leeds. And even before that, after the World War I, he temporarily had a job working on what becomes the Oxford English Dictionary. So words, language, all of this. And as many of you may already know, if you know Tolkien, once he eventually becomes a professor at Oxford, he develops close relationships with a number of other Oxford dons, a group they become to call themselves the Inklings, most notably C.S. Lewis, who Tolkien and Lewis had deep conversations about God and Christianity, and they supported each other in their various writing endeavors, and Tolkien very much credits Lewis for giving him the kind of oomph to get through The Lord of the Rings whenever Tolkien got stuck, and he got stuck an awful lot. All right, The Great War. There's actually a good book about this called Tolkien and the Great War, as well as a not-so-bad half-an-hour documentary on YouTube, for those of you who are inclined. It's during the Great War that Tolkien begins writing, first of all, sort of poems that contain characters' names and concepts that will later become his larger secondary world, as he called it, his larger mythology, which will eventually end up in published form in the Silmarillion. That all comes first, long before we have The Hobbit, long before we have The Lord of the Rings. And during World War I, of his 5 literary companions from his private school days, 3 of them die over the course of World War I. One of them, his closest friend perhaps, a guy named G.B. Smith, in his final letter to Tolkien said, "If I do not survive this war, make sure that you can do the work that I and the rest of us are not going to be around to do." And so for the rest of his days, Tolkien looked back at that as kind of a very important inspirational moment. And during these dark days of the Great War, and eventually Tolkien does go to the front. He's there after the Battle of the Somme begins. He arrives midway through. He sees the horrors of industrial warfare, which will leave an impact on him and his writings. But he begins, again, this is when he begins writing what will become the Silmarillion and becomes that deeper history that is in The Lord of the Rings. Let me see if I can figure out what I can get away with here. How many of you actually read the Silmarillion? God bless you. All right, we'll get to my first reactions to Silmarillion a little bit here shortly. I'll hit this point numerous times. A lot of scholars look at Tolkien's Great War experience, and for that matter, some people talk about the Second World War as well, and argue that The Lord of the Rings is an allegory. And that's, as Tolkien himself says, both in numerous letters and actually in a subsequent edition of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien says, I actually hate allegory in all of its forms, and when I find it, I try to stamp it out. However, as Tolkien himself would have said, and his son Christopher has certainly said, there's no doubt that you cannot divorce the person and the person's experiences from the fiction. So there's no doubt, as we'll see a little bit later on, that there are some elements of the Great War which ultimately make it into Lord of the Rings, most notably the Dead Marshes. And if you've read Lord of the Rings, you know this scene where Sam and Frodo and Gollum are going through a battlefield from the Second Age, in which it's blasted, it's barren of life. There seem to be holes in the ground full of dank water and the apparitions of the dead. There seems to be very little doubt that those images come from Tolkien's recollections of what it was like on the Somme. I will point out that Tolkien, we only have Lord of the Rings because Tolkien got sick. Tolkien got a kind of it was called trench fever, which was kind of a catch-all for a variety of respiratory infections that were in the trenches. He comes back to England and serves back and forth between active duty in England and hospital. And his unit is effectively annihilated in a subsequent battle on the Western Front. Tolkien, however, was not there. So this is the context of the Silmarillion. This is that larger world and the myth building long before The Hobbit, long before Lord of the Rings. And in fact, as we're going to see, he begins writing both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings without making any conscious connection to all of these essays and these stories and these tales and these poems that he's been writing for decades by the time we get to his conscious starting of The Hobbit in the 30s. The Silmarillion, as we know, was written and revised at least 3 times, each one very different from the other. And as Christopher Tolkien himself pointed out, you can almost see in the ways that Tolkien writes the Silmarillion over time the same kind of evolution you can find in ancient legends and myths that change over hundreds of years. Because of Tolkien changing the context by what he's writing in the present, and it goes back to the Silmarillion, the larger mythology, and has to try to integrate everything, and everything changes. Everything changes in relation to each other. There are some scholars who argue that Tolkien never really wanted to finish this larger mythology because it was his life's work, and if he ever finished, what was left? His son Christopher doesn't really believe that. His son Christopher believes that he was still working on, and he was, J.R.R. Tolkien was still working on this material at the time of his death, but it was too big, too massive. He was too old and too tired to ever fully get his head around this at the end of his life. But perhaps the most important tale for Tolkien personally out of the Silmarillion was the Lay of Beren and Luthien. This is the story of the man Beren, the mortal man, and the immortal elf Luthien, who fall in love. Luthien gives up her immortality as an elf to be with Beren, and through a variety of amazing stories, they tangle with Morgoth and steal one of the great jewels, one of the Silmarils, after whom the Silmarillion is named. And this is clearly a reflection of his relationship with his wife, Edith. In fact, as you may know, and I think I might have an illustration of this later, at their graveside, the headstone says, J.R.R. Tolkien, Baron, Edith Tolkien, Luthien. So the story goes, during the convalescence time during World War I, Tolkien and his bride-to-be would go off in the forest and she would dance for him. And that's supposed to have been inspired, the scene where Beren comes across Luthien in the forest and sees her dancing and falls in love. Okay, so after the war, Tolkien settles into Oxford, is married, has 4 children, and this process I love. So this is a process that is independent from the sort of amazingly deep mythology that we come to call the Silmarillion at larger world. This is the first of almost 20 years of Father Christmas letters. Every year, Tolkien writes, and you can also see his talent as an artist is also developing. And he does these amazingly intricate stories and letters to his children from Father Christmas. This is the first one, and by the way, these have not been published. It was edited by Christopher Tolkien's wife, and so these are out there, and they're really a lot of fun. So in this tradition of telling these very intricate stories to his children, and over time the children do figure out it's their father doing this, but they don't want him to know that they know because they don't want these things to stop, right? And so these letters keep coming. But you can see the amazing creativity and the amount of time that these would take. The Hobbit grows out of that tradition. And you may say, but this is about the Lord of the Rings, Antle. It is, but we got to go do this first to get there. So Tolkien begins this new set of stories after the Father Christmas letters have sort of become too juvenile, and the kids have figured it out. So he has a whole series of these stories, but one becomes what we know as the Hobbit. And the legendary story of how the Hobbit begins, and those of you who are professors in the room, strap yourselves in, you'll like this story. Tolkien was grading papers. And as he put it, it was an incredibly boring and mind-numbing experience. And he came across an essay, which, as he put it, I gave the student 5 extra points because the student left a blank page. And for some reason, Tolkien says, he decided to write on that, just spontaneously, in the hole in the ground lived a hobbit. He had no idea what a hobbit was, but he thought he should find out. And you find that kind of a line all the time in Tolkien's letters. I've come across this character named Faramir. I don't think I really like him, but we'll find out. So as he's writing, he has a general idea sometimes where he's going, but lots of times things just happen. The things pop out of his imagination that have been informed by decades of reading Beowulf, decades of looking at Norse sagas, decades of studying Finnish legend. And these things just keep popping out. And so he begins telling these stories to his kids, the story of the Hobbit, and he begins writing some of it down, beginning, it's kind of 1930. And he writes most of it down, at least it's kind of a draft form, and then he puts it away. And then a family friend who works for George Allen Unwin Publishing Company hears about this thing and says to the professor, can I show this to my publisher? Yeah, sure, whatever. So Unwin, Sir George Unwin, gives this manuscript to his son, who reads it, and the son, you can find this online, the son gives like a 6-sentence review and says, this is wonderful. In a hole in the ground lived a hobbit. It's a wonderful adventure, perfect for kids from ages 5 to 9. Ideally, you can tell it's a kid of a publisher, right? And so the book is put together. Tolkien finishes a draft. It's published in 1937, and holy smokes, a book which they thought might sell a couple thousand copies takes off as a children's book. It just takes off, and suddenly publishers Allen and Unwin decide, you know what? We think we need to learn more about hobbits. So we want you to write a sequel. And Tolkien says, yeah, okay. Because Tolkien was gratified that people were enjoying the kind of stories that he created. He enjoyed the act of storytelling, the act of what he called sub-creation. And so he enjoyed this. Now, when Tolkien begins to write this, there is no integration of the larger mythology. But by the time it's finished, there are some things in there that come from the larger mythology. The necromancer, Elrond. Okay, over time, these things, because they're up here, find their way in to the Hobbit and more so into the Lord of the Rings. So the Lord of the Rings is actually designed as a sequel to the Hobbit. And as some of you may know, the original hero of Lord of the Rings was going to be Bilbo again. And in fact, Tolkien, after he's written the entire thing with Frodo, almost goes back and changes Bilbo again. There's lots of going back and forth in terms of how this is all going to play out. It's written in stages between 1937 and 1949. And the tone shifts over time. And if you read the series, you notice this. The first half of Fellowship is very Hobbit-like in tone. You have this. What I think about most about that is you have this aside of a fox watching hobbits, go out on a journey, and the fox is going, "Hobbits on a journey? What next?" That kind of frivolity in the narration is basically gone by the time you get to the Two Towers. Things get much more serious. I blame the Balrog. So it takes him 12 years to write this. There are numerous times where he just gets stymied and he stops, and it's just a mess. But people like C.S. Lewis keep at him to keep it going. And eventually he gets it done. And of course also he has a publisher saying, come on, gimme. What the publishers get, though, is not what they expected. Especially as this thing evolves. It's not the Hobbit anymore. This is something else. This is something different. This is going to be an immense volume. And Tolkien, at one point in time, insisted this being published as one volume. But ultimately, he was persuaded 3, and so we have 3. In the interest of time, I won't go through the difficulties with switching publishers, which delays this for a while. And he also delays for a while because he spends so much time with those appendices that I fell in love with. It took a long time to finish those. So he finished the book in 49. It's not published till 1954. And then 3 volumes come out over the course of 54 and 55. And by the time Return of the King comes out in 1955, this too has become a thing. It lands and people pick it up and it sells. And it didn't just sell in England. It sold especially well in the United States, and particularly because of this company, Ace Paperback, who printed these up without any relationship to Tolkien at all. These are basically bootlegs. So Ace Books published Lord of the Rings in these paperback editions that sold big time in the United States. And Tolkien, upon discovering this, did a very interesting thing. As people were beginning to write Tolkien from the United States about, what is this character? What's this history? What is this thing? Tolkien writes back, "Thank you for your letter. Please make sure you and your friends don't buy the bootleg edition." And so this actually leads to Tolkien, who enjoyed writing letters, but eventually will shy away from all the fame he gets, developing kind of an interesting relationship with at least some of his American readers. And then in the Ballentine Edition, which is first of all, let's see, was it Ballentine to begin with? I'm going to space the exact, who had the first legit paperback version in the United States. It may have been Ballentine. He actually says, I appreciate those of you who are buying the authentic version. And so he was able to kind of shame American buyers into buying the legit editions, and Ace eventually leaves the field. Although I will say, Tolkien liked what the Ace covers looked like because they at least bore some relation to what the book was about, as opposed to the first Ballentine edition, which had funny things like llamas and weird flowers on the cover, which Tolkien didn't have any idea where they came from. The critics. There are plenty of them. Serious scholars, plenty, just tore into The Lord of the Rings as being a waste of an academic's time, as being sort of naive, as being too simplistic. And some of those critiques have continued to the present day. There was a retrospective which appeared in the New York Times Book Review in 2001, in which one critic said Tolkien's mission as an academic was to be a literary preservationist, the old English stories. She concluded, but as it turns out, Lord of the Rings has been a death to literature itself. The point that person's trying to argue is that too many young adults who could have been reading better literature spend their time reading J.R.R. Tolkien. And I remember in a junior high classroom of an English instructor named Anne Sullivan, there was a poster on the wall that said, great authors, Shakespeare, blah, 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 blah. And there was J.R.R. Tolkien. And I thought, well, hot damn, he made the list, I'm okay, right? But I think that today most critics would argue that Tolkien's active imagination puts him on that list, and he deserves to be on that list. But critics continue to be critics. Yeah. So junior high me got a hold of Silmarillion because it came out, about the same time. It came out about the time as I finished Lord of the Rings, and I got into this thing and went, what? Literally, what in the hell is this? It is a very different kind of story. It's written in a very different kind of tone. It has this kind of creation story, and it actually is a creation story itself, but it has a kind of tone to it. And so for someone who was used to rich description and was used to a fast-moving plot, this was a problem. And by the way, I think one reason why Lord of the Rings works, is kind of this deep world building that we credit it with, is that Tolkien combined that deep world building with a plot that moved, as opposed to some other epic fantasy series we can all name, in which the plot never freaking moves. Wheel of Time, I'm looking at you. So back to this notion of some of the themes in Lord of the Rings. So to a future historian, Tolkien's love of history, not allegory, because that's what he said. I despise allegory, I love history. And his ability to create this deep history with the poems, with the ruins, with the tales from previous ages is what attracted me. The appendices, the timelines, the world building, the places and the cultures feel real. The languages are effectively real. Quenya, the High Elvish language, is based on Finnish, but it has its own set of phonetic rules. Sindarin is based upon a hybrid of Welsh, but has its own very clear linguistic rules. And with those sets of rules, Tolkien could then go in and create the dictionary of whatever he needed as he went in the book. But again, this works because all this stuff happens in with a plot that actually goes somewhere. Themes. The cost of war. The Great War and the mechanization of the Great War combined together in a very sort of toxic set of memories for Tolkien. So here we have the toll of poison gas upon soldiers in World War I. These are all blinded soldiers who are leading each other off to hospital. The so-called lost generation, even those who come back in World War I, are not the same. Tolkien himself is not the same. His friends, most of them are dead. That leads him to think very deeply about mortality and immortality through the creative process. For Tolkien, some scholars argue, the elves are, in a sense, the perfection of man before the, without the fall, who are engaged in creativity. Although I would argue, certainly you look at the way the elves act in the Silmarillion, they ain't exactly perfect. There's lots of pride and those kind of things going on there. Frodo. Tolkien is very tough on Frodo. Frodo, as someone who just sort of may watch the movie may think, oh, Tolkien made Frodo the hero. He wins. Does Frodo win? Frodo loses everything. He is damaged. He is scarred. And as a result of the pain that carrying the ring causes him, remember at the end, at the slopes of Mount Doom, before the crack where he's getting ready to throw the ring down in this epic quest, he fails. At the end, he fails. And only his previous mercy of sparing Gollum saves the world from falling into a second darkness. Frodo comes back. He is grievously wounded. He holds on for years, but then eventually understands he has to leave this world and go to the Grey Havens and go to Valinor, the Undying Lands, in order to heal. And so here we have that scene at the end of Return of the King where Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel, Frodo, and Bilbo all sail off. So perhaps the question is, can you really go there and back again? You come back changed, and in many cases perhaps for the worse. Defending nature. A lot of this comes from, I'll wait for the slow chuckles here. Tolkien, of course, because he loved this landscape of the small villages and the forests and the creeks of the Midlands of England, west of Birmingham, he sees, over the course of his life, all that land consumed as Birmingham grows and industrializes. And so for him, Saruman, who Fangorn describes as a man with a mind of metal and wheels, and that's not intended to be a good thing, as being this kind of personification of the destruction of nature and the rise of a kind of industrialization that ultimately leads to the coercion of individuals. Tolkien was very old school conservative, very, libertarian is not quite the right word, but for him, magic or industry could all be used to the same end to corrupt and coerce individuals, and that was what evil was. And Saruman would do that. Orthanc, which had been a place of beauty, was turned into a place of horror. The nearby trees were cut down, and eventually nature fights back. Don't mess with the trees. One of my favorite scenes from the film adaptation of The Two Towers, of course, is when the Ents decide to get busy and destroy Saruman's Orthanc. And of course, trees play very important roles in Lord of the Rings. And this is a kind of nature that is not the kind of nature that's warm and fuzzy. This kind of nature had its own edge, its own consciousness, its own reason to exist, whether it be the trees of the old forest, Fangorn, where you have both Ents and the Huorns, which are the not quite so active trees, which still do a pretty good job of annihilating an orc army. Go Huorns. And then in Mirkwood, which you see much more of in The Hobbit, which is clearly a place which has its own set of problems in terms of consciousness and evil beings and creatures and spiders because of the presence of the necromancer, who we all know was actually Sauron. This all ties to Tolkien's disdain for not just industrialization, but also for modernity. He was Victorian, and so he certainly has some late 19th century old school attitudes about a variety of things. But you see that playing out in the Scouring of the Shire, which is the last part of Return of the King, which from a sort of perspective of a clean plot just seems weird. It just seems to be sort of an add-on, in fact, to the point where Peter Jackson leaves it out of his film adaptation altogether. But for Tolkien, this is critically important because it allows him to return to a theme that mattered to him a great deal, about how industrialization, the power of the machine, the rise to power of Ted Sandyman, the miller, in conjunction with old Sharky, who was actually Saruman, exiled from Orthanc. How this all could destroy the kind of world that Tolkien thought was ideal. And eventually, Sharky and his men are overthrown, the hobbits reclaim the Shire, and with soil and a seed from Galadriel, the Shire is replanted, and you have this magic Malorn tree growing in the Shire, and you even have a few examples of hobbit children having blonde hair as an example of the magic coming from the elves. This leads me to the portion of the Lord of the Rings that I now find the most relevant to what I do and what I think about the world. For Tolkien, partially because he was a conservative Catholic, partially because he had a disdain for machinery and what it was doing to the nature that he loved, he has it's the character Galadriel talking about, first of all, in the context of her husband Celeborn. He has dwelt in the West since the days of dawn, and I have dwelt with him years uncounted. For ere the fall of Nargothrond or Gondolin, that's the old Silmarillion stuff, I have passed over the mountains, and together through ages of the world we have fought the long defeat. We have fought the long defeat. In the case of the elves, as you learn in the Silmarillion, are designed, or design is the wrong word, but they're created to be part of Middle-earth, but eventually their destiny is to grow tired of Middle-earth and to leave it behind and go to Valinor. At the end of The Lord of the Rings, when the one ring is destroyed, the magic 3 rings of the elves lose their power, and Elrond and Galadriel grow eventually tired and weary, and they leave and they go to the west. Some elves will stick around longer, but this is really the end. And by this long defeat, if you read the Silmarillion, the glories of the ancient elvish cities are a far cry from what's left at the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, you go through ruin after ruin after ruin with hints of a glory that is now past and has now been lost. And despite all this, they keep fighting. They keep at it until Sauron, the heir to Morgoth, is defeated. Why do I find this interesting? I'm a historian, but I also am the director of the college's Center for Sustainability. I look around at what's happening in the world today, and I see that many of us are fighting the long defeat. A sense of the loss of traditions. Even if you win, you don't really win. If you do environmental work, if you win to protect something today, an election 2 years from now can overturn it. So while Tolkien talks about the passing of the elves, he's really talking about the loss of a whole series of values to him. To me, we're losing this. This is Iceland. And so I remember when I was reading Lord of the Rings, I said, God, I wish I could have gone to Lorien. I wish I could have gone to Rivendell and seen these glories before they were gone. I would encourage all of you in the age in which we live to go to this place, to go to Alaska, to go to the places that will not be the same when your grandchildren go there. Because we are all, whether you're fighting or not, we are all living the long defeat in terms of the natural world that you grew up with. And so to me, when I read Tolkien, beyond appreciation for the man's fertile imagination, his scholarly background, the things that attracted me once upon a time, it is this sense of loss, but fighting nonetheless, that keeps me coming back to the book. And the book keeps giving, or at least Tolkien's work keeps giving, through the tireless efforts of his third son, Christopher, who keeps, I think he's done now, but eventually published about 15 different volumes based upon Tolkien's notes and essays, and you can see how the work evolves in each one of these books. And by the way, Now that I've gotten older, I realize that my best copy of Lord of the Rings is a ragtag paperback copy. So I'll be taking a GoFundMe campaign to buy me the deluxe 60th edition going forward. And of course, what I really also enjoy about Lord of the Rings is it's become really part of the culture. Even if you've never read Lord of the Rings, you know what that is. You know why that's funny, right? Because one doesn't just walk into Mordor. And then, of course, I'm not going to play this for you, but I strongly encourage you all at some point to find Leonard Nimoy singing the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins. Any questions? And nothing about Smeagol, please. Or nothing about Deagle. Nothing about Deagle. Questions, thoughts?
We have time for just a few.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to comment. I didn't realize that you did like some drawings at first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, painting. I think it was watercolors. Yeah. And some of the, again, the first illustrations on those Ballentine covers, those were all hints. Yeah.
If you needed allegory someone, how did you and C.S. Lewis get along?
They got along less well over time.
Yeah.
And Christopher Tolkien tries to diminish that, saying that they just grew apart, literally, because he went to Cambridge, Lewis did, and Tolkien stayed back at Oxford. Humphrey Carter, in his biography of Tolkien, does a little more with that, and says that after Tolkien's, all of his work, and then Lewis writes the Chronicles of Narnia, Tolkien choked on the allegory in that. And there's even an implication that Tolkien found the kind of juvenile nature of Narnia almost a pale, insulting imitation of his own work. Now, to be clear, that's just one biographer's interpretation. Nowhere do we have Tolkien writing that.
Right.
But yes, there is that. Yes, oh, bearded one.
Yes. You mentioned, Jackson left off the scholars of the Shire from his adaptation. I was thinking about the nature. Also, another part that was left out is old Tom Bombadil.
Yes.
And his kind of his whatever.
That's right, his whatever.
His whatever. Yes. So I was wondering what you thought about that in terms of the nature. Like Tom Bombadil, obviously, that connection to nature, like withdrawn.
It's a very strange connection, which never even fully explained in the narrative. Elrond himself goes, we don't really know who he is, right? And what's really funny about that is one of the first poems that Tolkien writes that ends up in Lord of the Rings is a sort of a weird poem about Tom Bombadil before he had any idea who Tom Bombadil was. So there are also poems that he's writing, back in the 19-teens that end up in Lord of the Rings, like that coward over the moon thing that Frodo does when he falls off the table. So this stuff's was floating around in his head for a long time. But yeah, in terms of that love of nature, whatever Tom Bombadil and the River Daughter are, they clearly are tied to nature in some way. I'm not really sure I can speak about his own personal experience with music, but certainly yes. I mean, he comes. I'm guessing some of that might come from. Anything I would say right now would be just me spitballing. I don't actually know. I mean, there's some stuff that would be more formal that would come from that kind of Catholic tradition, but I think some of that may also come from what you would find in the sort of seriousness of some of the Norse legends. But in terms of the sort of more fanciful stuff, the Hobbit-y stuff, I don't know. Other questions? It's really funny. Nowhere in the biographies that I've read is that really addressed very much. A lot about obviously the language, but not so much about the music and the sing-song nature. Yes.
People like Terry Brooks today, in his writing, he plays on magic versus science a lot. I think Tolkien did that also. I mean, it's kind of like this industrialization versus naturalization.
Well, the thing is, I mean, here's a case of where you as the reader can see, you see what you see. Tolkien himself, in a couple of cases, wrote letters where he said that, again, and I made this point earlier, that magic can be just as much a tool of coercion as can mechanization, or science would be the equivalent. So for him, it would be not necessarily about means, it would be about ends, which could be the same. He also said in a letter, make sure I get this right, that the worst case scenario in Middle-earth was not Sauron getting a ring, it would have been Gandalf getting the ring. Because Sauron, you knew what Sauron was. Gandalf would not just be domineering, he would be self-righteously domineering. Because he would do all these evil things under the guise of wanting to do good. And so that's why I think Tolkien purposefully has Gandalf get away from the ring, and more importantly, has Galadriel get away from the ring. Because if you look at the history of the elves back in the Silmarillion, there are times when elves made the equivalent of other choices to the damnation of everybody. Galadriel does not choose the power, and she says, I have passed the test. I shall grow diminished, and I shall go to the west.
All right, thank you, Jay.
Thanks. Thanks for coming out, folks.